We are off to the races. Good evening. Welcome back to Moto Talk with Steve and Kim. I'm Steve, and that's Kim over there.
Happy Tuesday.
Hey, happy Tuesday. Hope everybody's doing well. We're not going to wait until anybody gets online because this is it's a recording, and people will be able to log on and just watch it. Now I got to turn this off here. Little technical difficulty.
Yeah, little feedback loop.
Feedback loop is
now we're
fixed. All right. Hey, hope you're all doing well. I see y'all logging on. We're going to talk today about buying a motorcycle. Not necessarily vintage, not necessarily a new one. You buy a new one, you got a new motorcycle. But we're going to talk about that here in a little bit. Just a couple announcements, some stuff that's coming up here. Let's see here. Get my glasses in the right spot. 4/18/2021, Goshen, Indiana. They usually put on an annual vintage motorcycle show. This will be the 6th annual. They had to skip last year, so they did not have a 5th annual. I guess this would be the 5th annual.
I guess
on the 6th year. Anyway, that will be on 4/18, and I don't know any more about that other than I think it's a 2-day event. Saturday, Sunday. We'll get some more details as it gets closer to that. I've not been to that one yet. Kim's not been to that one yet. I do know that it's it's vintage, probably mostly Japanese and European, but there'll probably be some Harleys and Indians there.
I know that area of the state's really busy. I mean, there's a lot of people doing business with vintage bikes up there. There's a lot of people clear up to the Michigan line, all the way back down.
What was the group you were talking about earlier? The VJM vintage?
Yeah, vintage Japanese motorcycle.
Yeah, I always get it mixed up in my mind because I can't see words and letters in my head. I have to write it all down.
Yeah,
well, they've been around a long time.
Yeah, VJMC's been around a long time. There are quite a few people from Central Indiana that have been officials for VJMC. That would include people like Barry Schonberger that you've seen on here. And we get an awful lot of support from Barry for a number of reasons. He's very knowledgeable and he's all up in the sport to his neck. And then there's another fellow that if you went to the dryer shows over the last couple of years, he was there representing the VJMC. His name's Ellis Holman. I actually worked with Ellis 40 years ago at IBM, and he's still an IBM consultant. Super knowledgeable guy, knows all there is to know about esoteric Hondas in particular, but he's really, really good.
Well, up and around the Goshen area have been at least one guy that I knew when I was buying bikes like out of sheds and barns. There was a gentleman up that way, like Bremen area or something like that. That was the president of the group back in the day, and he had a lot of Honda Dream stuff.
Yeah, there's a famous old BSA dealer up there too, Bushy BSA, and I think the son is still involved.
John says no video. I don't know how that is. Remove us and add us. We've got a few people on there. If you have a problem seeing our video, let me know. Otherwise, it's going to be a real podcast with just audio.
Yeah, it might be a better thing. Listening to us is better than looking at us.
We have faces for radio, and not necessarily even voices for radio. But let's go on to the next one here. We do have the 38th Midwest Motorcycle Swap Meet, which is Matt Ring says it's working fine. Okay, that's good. Maybe just on one end of the Facebook page is Roger has video. All right. This is mostly a Harley swap meet. We talked about it last week. It used to be at the Marion County Fairgrounds, and now it's at the Hendricks County Fairgrounds in Danville. 38th Midwest Motorcycle Swap Meet, and that will be April 24th, Saturday and Sunday, April 25th. So if you're looking for something, plan on mostly, I would say 98% Harley stuff there.
Yeah, but that being said, I'd also say on occasion there's a gem hidden somewhere among all that Harley stuff, because the Harley guys have also had other bikes, maybe took it in trade, maybe had it and chopped it. Who knows how they came across it, but a lot of times you can find some things that you might want or might be interested in that aren't Harley related. So it's worth going.
I rode my my first year CB750 over to one time. I had no clue what it was all about, and as I was riding in, I could hear guys standing around going, "There's a bleepity bleep Honda."
Yeah, who's that guy?
Who in the world is that guy? Anyway, I was just dumb, I guess. I just rode over there on it. All right. So we've talked about this several times. I've bought a bunch of bikes over the last 10 years, mostly vintage. But I bought some running and riding used bikes, and we're going to talk about that tonight. We're talking about what do I do when I go buy a motorcycle? So let's say you're new to motorcycles, you don't have a whole lot of experience necessarily buying them or even necessarily riding them, and you want to get your first motorcycle or you want to go buy another motorcycle. What are some of the things that I should look for? Especially if maybe you are not as mechanically minded as someone you would take the motorcycle to get worked on, if it's something you can't do yourself. But you can certainly figure out some things to help you look for a motorcycle. And on my other sheet here, these are 4 things that when a motorcycle comes into my shop that I check no matter what, even if they wrote it there. These are things I check to just be sure that we can move on to whatever next steps the customer wants.
In our case, a lot of times the customer's not even aware that these things are problems.
Right.
You know, they bring it in and it is what it is,
Right.
and they're used to it, whatever's happening with it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the very first thing that we check is compression. There's no use in putting new tires, new chain, new sprocket. There's no use in getting a paint job done on your tank until you've done a compression check and you know the engine's going to run.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of central to the whole bike to have the engine be in reasonable condition. And if it's got reasonable, it doesn't mean it has to be perfect by specs. It just means if there's a gaping hole, it could be a real problem. It could be destroyed just riding it.
So there's a couple ways you can check compression. You can check it the backyard Bobby way, which I'll explain that since I'm more of a backyard Bobby. And you, as a Robert Senior, we'll have to tell the story later.
Yeah.
Anyway,
different motorcycle.
I'll be the backyard Bobby, and you be the refined professional. So what you would do basically is you take your spark plugs out of the engine. It might be an inline 4, it might be a twin, it might be a V twin,
might be a single.
Might be a single. So you take the spark plug out, and you stick your thumb on the spark plug hole, and you kick it over. Now you might have to have someone else kick it over for you, but if it's popping your thumb off of the spark plug hole, that means it does have compression.
It means it does have probably enough to run.
Yeah.
Usually
it might have enough to run. But you'll know if it doesn't have compression, it's not going to pop your thumb off the hole there. Right. And then you may have some issues. Now, the professional way to do it would be,
well, there's a tool for it, for one thing, and it's a compression tester that screws into the spark plug hole when you take the spark plug out. The method is that you put the compression tester on. It's a dial gauge. We don't have one here, but we had a dozen of them in the shop. You screw it in there. You hold the throttle wide open to make sure that there's plenty of air moving into and out of the engine, and then you kick it several times, and you see what that reading is. Almost all bikes, especially Japanese bikes, have something between 125 and maybe 160 pounds of pressure from the specs that are in the books. Doesn't mean that it won't run if it's less than 160. A lot of times it'll run at 100 or 90 or whatever, because some of the big V twins, their specs are in the 90s, and it's not uncommon for that. It's a lot to do with the compression ratio, how long the valve overlap is, stuff like that. So professionally you can do that. But then the next part of the professional test is, if you do have low compression, you can determine somewhat where that low compression is coming from by putting some oil in the cylinder and doing it again. You do it again. If it raises the compression significantly, it means that you've probably got a ring seal problem. If it doesn't raise it significantly, you've probably got a valve seal problem. So you can kind of determine which one your problem is. And it's far more common to have valve problems than ring problems. So you can usually figure out what's what.
Yeah. Okay. So we have a really great question here, Keith. Saying that kind of sarcastically. If you get your thumb stuck in the hole, you're not doing it right. You just put it over the hole. Okay.
Yeah, I recommend for you specifically, if you get your thumb stuck in there, put your nose in it the next time.
Yeah. Anyway, another thing that you want, if you have more than one cylinder, you want both cylinders or all 3 or all 4 cylinders to be somewhere within, 10% range of each other as far as what the compression reading is if you're using the actual tool to see how many psi each cylinder has. The next thing that we would do in the shop is we would lift the back end up, and we would go through all the gears. And to go through all the gears on a motorcycle when it's not running, you basically need to move the tire forward and backwards to actuate the chain, which would turn the transmission back and forth so that you can go into each individual gear. You want to make sure that the bike will move into each individual gear so that you don't have any transmission problems. Do you have anything to add to that?
No, it's, you want to leave the clutch out and just run it through the gears.
Right.
Obviously with the engine not running, you just want to see if it goes in and comes out and goes into neutral relatively easily. You can do that by hand. It doesn't require any special tools or anything.
Right. Keith and Roger are asking about valves, so we'll leave that to another discussion. But some have valves and some don't, and these guys are two-stroke guys. So
yeah, a valve for you guys is that thing on the side that looks like a pizza that's got a section cut out of it. Then the carburetor's on the outside of the engine sucking through that thing. That's a valve in your eyes.
Yeah, Jeff, that would be the same for the shaft drives. You can manipulate those to go through the gears as well.
Yeah, there is one thing that's kind of a little different. Shaft drive motorcycles versus chain drive motorcycles. One thing that's different about that is that with a chain drive motorcycle, it's relatively easy. We're kind of jumping ahead here. I'm jumping ahead here. It's relatively easy to push it and put it in gear and try to make it start that way. You can't really do that with a shaft drive motorcycle. There's too much mechanical advantage with the ring and pinion. It'll just drag the tire. And if you've got a BMW and you're going down the road at 40 miles an hour and you turn the engine off, turn it back on with the clutch out, and then let the clutch back out again, you'll see that it'll drag the tire just because that's the way they are.
But we're mainly talking about just checking to see that the gears work in the transmission part.
Yeah, that'll work fine as long as the rear wheel's off the ground.
Okay, so the third thing that we would look at is spark, and we would kind of move on to the charging system. So to check for spark, the Bobby way would be you take your spark plugs out of the engine so that your engine can turn over freely. And then you take, say, number one spark plug or spark plug wire, and you put a spark plug in it, and then you put the ground of the spark plug up against the engine case, and you turn the bike over with power and see if it sparks.
Or you just hold on to it.
Or you hold on to it, or you stick it on your tongue.
Which you might find unpleasant if it's got a really good spark.
That's true. And so you move from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, however many cylinders your bike has. And if you do have a running bike, one thing that you would want to check if you're buying a bike is if you know how to use a meter at all, you would check for the charging system. You want to see that the charging system is charging the battery while the bike is running. Now, it may not charge very high at an idle, so that's where you would rev the bike up to 2,500 to 3,000 RPMs and see that you're somewhere above 12, 8, 13. A lot of people are going to say, no, it has to be 14 volts, period. You're not going to find that on a lot of older bikes, but I would say on most of the newer bikes, you're going to be in the 13 to 14 range.
Yeah, the old bikes didn't have accessory ports. They didn't have other kinds of things to connect to them. All it was the spark plug and the lights. And very often, the only reason the batteries in some of those bikes is because they're running a magneto to do the spark, but the battery's there to assure that the lights work when it's shut off, when the engine's off. That was a U.S. requirement for safety reasons, and they started doing that probably in the 60s.
Right.
But most of the time, you can tell if it's got something greater than 12, and I'm going to say 12 and a half volts is probably almost acceptable if you have all the lights and everything on when it's running. It's above 12, and as long as it doesn't drop down below about 11 and a half at some point when you shut it off, it's probably going to work.
Right.
Maybe not well or for a long time, but it'll work.
There are also a lot of bikes out there where Mr. Previous Owner is thinks he's an electrician, right? And he wants to add a bunch of wires and gizmos and USB ports and all this kind of stuff. And
Neon.
sometimes he won't put that in through the ignition key where it would shut everything off, and it'll put a draw on the battery. So, I mean, those things you can check as well. One thing that Kim and I were discussing earlier was just the fact that, hey, Dave Gardner. I need a little shout out to Randy Schwind. He actually sent me an email to mototalk123@gmail.com and actually was asking some of these questions. And I created this particular episode back last week with the title of buying a new bike or buying a new used bike, a new U-bike. And yeah, some of these questions he sent to us via email. So thanks, Randy Schwind. The next thing that what we talked about earlier today was how do you determine the value of a bike? So we deal with all kinds of bikes from 1940s all the way up to 2021. But when you're buying a used bike, most of the time you're going to be in the 2000s range as far as the years. And there are set guides that say, okay, this bike is worth this. And we're talking about NADA, and we're talking about Kelley Blue Book, and you can get a general idea of what a bike is worth. Now, unless it's say an H2 Kawasaki or a first year CB750, where the prices in those books are not going to be anywhere near what the actual desire value is.
I think they try to do an algorithm that keeps pace with what's being sold, generally, but they're always inaccurate. They have spikes. There was a recent sale on one of the sale websites. I'm not even going to use their name because I don't want to necessarily promote them, but a bid went on a typical Honda Dream, and it sold for, I think, $34,000. So that's certainly atypical and won't look like that in NADA. Mecum, if you follow their stuff, it kind of shows you about what they're going for, at least in their averages. And if they're unusual bikes, their prices are pretty good.
Sometimes it looks to me like it's a little over, though. Like the last year or two, you've seen some bikes like Keith and I have talked about this Honda Dream that supposedly went for $22,000 or more. That's just an anomaly. To me, that's an anomaly.
Yeah.
And or a no way type of thing.
And the other thing is, with used bikes, particularly sought after, what people consider collector bikes, they have ebbs and flows of interest. For a while they'll be really hot. Triumph Bonnevilles were like this about 5 or 6 years ago, where you'd find a 69 Bonneville in really good shape and it'd be $15,000.
Right.
Now 69 Bonneville's good for about 8 to 9, if something like that. CB750s, I think for a couple of reasons, Honda CB750s are kind of still on a bit of a high because it was recently the 50th anniversary. There was a lot of press. Honda itself promoted it. There were companies promoting it. There was a lot of attention being paid to it. And then people with all money and not much experience got involved in speculating on some of these bikes, and they wound up selling for a lot of money. On the other hand, there are some benchmarks. Benchmark bike would be something built by a guy named Vic World, as an example. They're not the same as other people's bikes. He uses he uses exclusively Honda NOS from the period. It has to be the right thing. He doesn't use knockoff parts.
He bought it all out way back in the day. And
he started buying it in the late 70s. One thing you might not know about Vic World is he didn't get his money from building motorcycles. It was a hobby. As I understand it, Vic made his money with those little jelly armbands that you see.
Yeah, the glow sticks.
Yeah, glow sticks and jelly armbands that have like WWJD on them, stuff like that. He sold 800 bazillion of those things, and that's where the money came from.
Right. So let's get back into the more modern bike, where a lot of the base here would be into when I think of buying a new bike, and I think of customers that come to the shop. Most of the time we're talking almost a Honda Shadow. Almost all the time you're talking a Honda Shadow, a V-Star,
super popular,
some type of a cruiser bike, a Harley, a Sportster. And, a lot of the times they'll bring it for some type of a safety check where we run through the whole bike to see, what all's wrong with it. And so, yeah, you want to look for oil leaks. You want to look for low miles, and what is considered low miles for a bike. I mean, a lot of these don't get ridden very much.
Yeah, I think it's changed, and I think it's different per motorcycle. If it's maintained and used and regularly cared for, it can be in the 30s and 40,000s, and it's not that big a deal. It used to be that if you got 10,000 miles out of a bike back in the 60s and 70s, that was a lot. But even that was a little bit of a false indicator, because if you've ever been overseas, particularly in England, you'd see BSAs and Triumphs that have been on the road for 20 years, and people put 100,000 miles on them routinely. Right. So it's just they use them differently than we do. In the United States, it's more of a toy. People buy it, park it, leave it alone. Then you have other problems, and then they have to be fixed. And then when they're fixed, they're not always right. So you don't get as many miles out of those bikes as you might get if you use it every day.
Yeah. One thing that I like to talk about with some people is, okay, so I've got a friend. I'll give you a scenario. I've got a friend, Keith's friend, maybe. He's got a Honda Shadow that's been sitting for 8 years, and I'm getting a great deal on it. I'm getting it for $500, and I want to get it and get it taken care of. What is the difference between taking something like that and getting it fixed, and actually finding one that's turnkey, already being ridden, and ready to go down the highway?
Yeah. So the biggest things are just sitting for 8 years. It has a lot to do with where did it sit? And more often than not, if it sat for 8 years, probably wasn't terribly important to the people that owned it, and they put it in some place that was not the best place for it to be. So it might be dented up. It might have been through cold and heat. It might have been through moisture. It's going to have problems with the fuel system. It's going to have problems with the electrical system. It's going to have corrosion on it. The tires are going to be different than if they'd been stored properly. I mean, it's going to be a mess. A
lot of times you'll get into cost where the cost is actually higher than something you could find already running, riding, has been maintained, and ready to go down the road.
Yeah, this happens all the time.
Maybe in better condition, maybe not, but usually not.
Yeah, and we try to guide people.
Usually the eight-year sitting bike is not as in as good a condition as something that's still running.
Yeah, almost never. Once in a great while you have somebody who maybe carefully put it away. And when they carefully put it away, they took care of some of the things that might go bad if they kept it in a safe environment where it was climate controlled, not moist, maybe even covered it. There's what do I want to say here? The jury's out with regard to covering a motorcycle. It depends on what you cover it with. If you're covering it with a blanket that's thick and retains moisture, that's a bad plan. If you're covering it with something that doesn't let moisture get out, keeps moisture from coming in, that's also a bad plan. Right. It's better to put something on it that maybe is purposely built for that, so that the air can get around it and move around. And if you've got bikes stored somewhere where the climate isn't ideal, it's a good idea to keep a fan going as well to keep the air moving around and keep it from being damaged.
This is actually a pretty good suggestion here. If you see a bike and it's got a bunch of wire nuts on it, like
like
that
housing.
you use in a house, right. Wire nuts putting wiring together, that really is something that you should just run away from.
Or if you see speaker wire somewhere in the wiring harness, which is really common, or if you see those little blue things that snap over and you clamp onto the wire so you can get another wire, that's not great either.
So one interesting thing, Clayton Foster, a good friend of ours, bought a newer dirt bike for himself. It was a 252 stroke, and it had a clutch issue. And when they took the clutch cover off and the clutch basket out and everything, it had a beer can in there shimming something, like a literal beer can. So wire nuts, beer cans, speaker wire, let's stay away from that. Let's move on to something that's a little more.
The other thing we didn't talk about with, and I saw this on one of the forums just yesterday, we didn't talk about when you have a long-term storage thing, even if it's in your house, rodents tend to find their way in there. And we've had all kinds of interesting nests inside motorcycles in places you wouldn't believe they could get. Inside the exhaust, they'll crawl in there and put all of their junk that they bring in.
Yeah, you're talking mud daubers to chipmunks to mice.
Yep, and inside air cleaners is one of their favorite places to be, or inside the bottom of a seat. They can populate that thing for years, and then it's really damaging.
And that's another great suggestion, is just if you can figure out where the air box is, open the air box and see what the condition is inside. When I buy dirt bikes, you check the dirt bike out. They may have freshly cleaned it and got all the dirt and mud off of it, which it's normal. It's going to get that. But if you pull the seat and look at the air filter, you'll know if the bike has been taken care of or not.
Yeah.
Because if they went through the trouble of cleaning the bike up and all that, and they haven't swapped out the air filter, it's going to be nasty dirty. And they probably are going to be running it with a nasty dirty air filter the next time.
Yeah. And one thing we haven't really, we'll probably have a show on this, but there's such a big difference between a vintage street bike and a vintage dirt bike.
True.
Vintage dirt bikes were usually built, even if they were professional level dirt bikes, they didn't have sealed bearings. They were much less maintenance forgiving. And if you rode them in dusty conditions, the bike could pretty much be destroyed in 2 races. If you were out there or you rode it in wet conditions or in mud, you can hose it off at the car wash, but it doesn't fix the problems.
Right.
And then all the lubricant's gone. You got to kind of start over to make sure that everything works, because they'll wear out very quickly. May even be dangerous if you don't pay attention to it.
Right. So what else can we check? Another thing you can look at is tires, but tires can always be changed out.
Yeah, most of the time.
So I think we covered the important parts. You can look for oil leaks. You can look for missing parts. If you look up a stock bike and you're buying a stock bike, and I suggest that for your first bike, you buy a bike that's all stock, where nothing has been modified. When a bike is modified, that's where you get into a little bit of trouble. People like to get in and tinker with the wiring. They may have put a different front end on it. They may have put a different wheel, and maybe the rotor doesn't match up with the caliper very well. And that brings me to another thought. You also want to check out the brakes. A lot of the rear brakes on bikes, even close to newer bikes, are rear drum, and
most of the shaft drive bikes,
usually don't get too worn out unless the guy likes to ride the rear brakes. So we can talk about what brake to use the most, front or back, in a later show. But one thing you might want to check is just the fact that, did you see Killer back there?
Mm-hmm. You just walk through.
Is you might want to check the front brake to see if the caliper's sticking or not. And you can also take the cap off of the master cylinder and look at the fluid inside and see if it's real brown or nasty, then you know it needs changed. Most bikes that come inside for a front to back check over and they've been sitting a while, the brakes are going to get gone through. The Randy Schwartz just said, check the inside of the gas tank, and that should be next. But you're going to have the brakes gone through, the carbs gone through. Look inside the tank. Usually they're rusty if they've been sitting for 8 or 9 or 10 years, and they may have even developed some pinholes in the tank. So there's a lot of things to look for. Another suggestion, just like when you're buying a car, is if you can take the bike to a professional and have them check it out for you. Maybe you don't know how to do a lot of things, but you just want to ride something. Have them check it out, and that's a good negotiating tool for buying a bike.
Yeah, maybe take somebody with you that has some experience.
Right. Yeah.
Good plan.
All right. Well, we're about to wrap it up here. I think we're going to move on to motorcycle essentials with Kim. He's brought in a couple more things to show us.
Yeah, I wanted to start with the most fundamental things that you should have around your shop if you're going to even work on your bike at all. And that includes anything you might do, sometimes just as simple as adjustments. But I've shown you some things already, but I should have started at the more fundamental parts. I brought you a couple of things here that everybody should have. And it starts with these.
Dun, 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 dun.
If you don't have these, you need to have them, because you can't replicate or regenerate your eyesight.
Your eyeball.
And I was a late adopter to this, but I've had enough incidents where I might have sprayed some chemical close to my face and it wound up in my eye and I lost it for a day or so, or some particle came flying off of it, or maybe I was pressing on something and it came loose and wound up in my face. And I've ridden everybody that I've been around that works on motorcycles to wear safety glasses, because it's really, really important.
Kim is our safety glass security guard.
And I wouldn't have, like I said, I was a late adopter, but I make sure I wear them all now because I've had too many incidents over time. And then another thing that's absolutely important is
Who doesn't like Cool Whip?
who
You need
doesn't like
Cool
Cool Whip and ricotta cheese? Everybody should have this.
Always have that sitting around at the shop.
These things are always good for something because they're durable. You can put brake fluid in them and clean it out. You can put gasoline in it and clean it out. You can put parts in there to keep them organized. You got smaller ones or bigger ones. If you got a small one, it might have a lid like this. You can mark it. The other thing I do with them is I cut these into 4 pieces, like 4 pizza slices, and I put them in between the rim and the lever I'm using on a tire to try to lever the wheel on. That keeps the rim from being damaged. So you can throw these away or you can keep them and use them. But I think they're so vital to everything you do in the motorcycling industry that everybody should have them. The other thing about these is they're very slick. So they're almost like a lubricant. If you're putting it on something, they're easy to manage. So you can destroy them, use them, make whatever you need to make out of it, and they're very good.
Kim keeps a stash of these, and we rummage through it all the time.
Yep.
I've even made fork seal cleaners out of it, where if you take one of those little pizza slices and then you cut a little notch, you can actually get it in the seal there and clean dust and dirt out of the seal to try to make it not leak.
Yeah, I know there's a school of thought out there that there's a way to do that, and it extends the life of your seals, but
most of the time they need
I was going to say most of the time
your fork seals are leaking.
They're
they need
done.
redone.
Yeah.
That's another thing you can look for when you're buying a bike.
Right.
All right. Well, hey, we're about to wrap it up here. Safety tip of the day: get your braking done while you're going straight before you hit the turn, and always look for an out. Hey, we hope to see you next Tuesday. Have a great week. And hopefully we get some riding this weekend. You guys take care. Bye-bye.
First day of spring is Friday.
Don't forget to go out and buy some Cool Whip right away, okay?
Yeah.